Canada and the United States share the largest trading relationship in history. $700 billion of goods and services cross that border every year. 77% of Canada's exports go to one customer. 20% of Canada's entire GDP depends on selling things to that one country next door. For 30 years, that was the smartest trade in the world. Then, in February 2025, the United States imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods. Canada's goods exports to the U.S. dropped 15% in a single month. Economists estimate the tariff cycle has already reduced Canadian GDP by 1.5 to 2%. The Bank of Canada is forecasting growth of only 1.25% for the next 2 years. Algoma Steel announced 1,000 layoffs. The manufacturing of wood products dropped 7.3% in 1 month, the largest decline since the pandemic. Canada did not stumble into this dependency. It chose it, deliberately, rationally, over 30 years of trade policy that made Canada one of the most prosperous countries on Earth. This episode is the story of how that choice was made, what it produced, what it is now costing, and whether a country can rebuild its economic relationships in months when it took decades to build the ones it had. Canada's economic story is not well understood outside of Canada, and often not well understood inside Canada either. The country tends to be seen from the outside as either a frozen wilderness or a smaller, quieter version of the United States. Neither is accurate. Canada is the 9th largest economy on Earth. It is the world's 4th largest oil producer. It has the largest freshwater reserves on the planet. It grows more wheat than almost any other country. It produces more than half the world's potash, the fertilizer that feeds a significant fraction of global agriculture. Canada has every natural advantage a development economist could want. And yet, for the past 3 decades, Canada has conducted its economic affairs as though none of those advantages mattered, except in their relationship to the United States. This episode is the story of why, and what happens when that relationship is suddenly no longer guaranteed. Chapter 1. How the dependency was built. The Canada-US dependency was not an accident of geography. It was a deliberate policy choice made in stages over 3 decades, beginning with the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement of 1988 and deepened by NAFTA in 1994 and the USMCA in 2020. In 1988, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and President Ronald Reagan signed the FTA, the first comprehensive bilateral free trade agreement between the two countries. The argument for it was straightforward. Canada's economy was smaller, its domestic market was smaller, and its industries could only achieve the scale they needed to compete globally if they had guaranteed access to the American market. Free trade with the U.S. was not just a commercial arrangement, it was a development strategy. It said, we will specialize in what we are best at. We will sell it to the largest market in the world without tariff barriers, and the resulting productivity and prosperity will exceed anything a protected domestic market could produce. The argument was correct. The Canada-US FTA and then NAFTA produced exactly the economic outcomes their architects promised. Canadian manufacturing productivity rose sharply in the 1990s as industries exposed to American competition either improved or exited. Export volumes grew. GDP per capita grew. The 1990s and 2000s were decades of broadly shared Canadian prosperity, the kind of prosperity that built the healthcare system, the social safety net, and the high standard of living that Canadians correctly identify as their national achievement. Here's the question I want you to sit with for the next 10 minutes. If someone offered you free access to the world's largest economy right next door with no tariff barriers and deeply integrated supply chains, and the only condition was that 77% of your exports would flow to that one customer, would you take the deal? The answer for Canada in 1988 was yes. The question this episode eventually answers is, was that the right answer? Chapter 2. What the dependency produced. The numbers that describe Canada-US economic integration are extraordinary. By 2024, the two countries were exchanging approximately $700 billion in goods and services annually, making it the largest bilateral trade relationship in history. The automotive sector alone sends components across the Canada-US border an average of 7 times before a finished vehicle rolls off the assembly line. A car manufactured in Ontario contains parts made in Michigan, assembled in Mexico, with software designed in California. The supply chain is not North American because 3 governments decided it should be. It is North American because that is the most economically efficient way to build a car, and efficiency built over 30 years of integration does not rebuild in months. Canada's oil and gas sector, the world's 4th largest, sends approximately 88% of its energy exports to the United States. Canadian pipelines flow south. American refineries process Canadian crude. The energy infrastructure of the two countries is physically integrated in ways that make separation enormously costly for both sides. The Keystone XL pipeline, canceled and then reconsidered multiple times, is the most visible symbol of an energy dependency that exists regardless of the pipeline's fate. Chapter 3. The productivity gap nobody talked about. The tariff war has exposed a structural problem in the Canadian economy that existed before February 2025 and would have required attention regardless of what happened at the border. Canada has a productivity problem. GDP per capita in Canada has been growing more slowly than in the United States for the better part of 2 decades. Canadian workers are productive, but Canadian firms invest less in technology, in automation, and in research and development than their American or European counterparts. The result is an economy that generates comfortable living standards, but not the kind of compounding productivity growth that creates durable wealth. The Bank of Canada's February 2026 Structural Review, published just last month, identifies the productivity gap as the central long-term risk to the Canadian economy, independent of tariffs. The bank's diagnosis is precise. Canada has low business investment per worker, low adoption of technology in the services sector, and a business environment that has historically been comfortable enough that Canadian firms did not need to be as productive as their American competitors to survive. The protected domestic market, the guaranteed American export access, and the resource revenues from oil and gas created enough cushion that Canadian firms could generate adequate returns without world-class efficiency. The tariff war has removed that cushion. Suddenly, Canadian manufacturers competing in the U.S. market face a 25% price disadvantage that no amount of operational efficiency can fully absorb. The firms that survive will be the ones that were productive before, and there are many of them. The firms that were comfortable will not survive. Chapter 4. Internal Trade, the barrier nobody mentions. There is a specific Canadian irony that this episode cannot skip. It is easier, in many sectors, for a Canadian company to export goods to the United States than to sell them in another Canadian province. Canada's internal trade barriers, the regulatory differences, licensing restrictions, and procurement rules that fragment the Canadian domestic market into 13 separate provincial and territorial economies, are estimated to cost the Canadian economy between $50 billion and $130 billion per year in foregone productivity. A doctor licensed in Ontario cannot practice in British Columbia without requalifying. A construction worker certified in Quebec cannot work in Alberta without additional paperwork. A Canadian brewery cannot ship its beer freely across provincial lines. The barriers exist because each province built its own regulatory framework, its own professional licensing system, and its own government procurement preferences over 150 years of confederation. And the political will to harmonize them has never been sufficient to overcome the provincial resistance to change. Mark Carney's government has made the elimination of internal trade barriers a central pillar of the economic response to the tariff war, correctly identifying that a country which cannot trade freely with itself will struggle to trade effectively with the world. The question is whether the political urgency of the tariff crisis is sufficient to override 150 years of provincial resistance to economic integration. It has not been sufficient in any previous crisis. The tariff war may be the first crisis large enough to change that. Chapter 5. What the tariffs actually did. The 25% tariffs imposed by the United States in February 2025 hit 5 Canadian sectors with particular severity: automotive, steel and aluminum, softwood lumber, energy, and agricultural products. Each sector has its own story. Automotive is the most complex. The Canada-US-Mexico automotive supply chain is the most integrated manufacturing system in the world. Components cross borders an average of 7 times before a finished vehicle is produced. A 25% tariff on Canadian automotive parts does not simply make Canadian parts more expensive in the US. It disrupts assembly lines on both sides of the border. Because American assembly plants that depend on Canadian components now face cost increases that ripple through their entire production schedule. Canadian value-added motor vehicle production was down 3% in the first year of tariffs, but that number understates the disruption because the companies most exposed have been restructuring their supply chains in ways that will produce larger employment effects over the next 18 months. Steel and aluminum were hit by Section 232 tariffs, the national security tariffs that Trump used in his first term and reimposed in his second. Algoma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie announced 1,000 layoffs. Sectors impacted by Section 232 tariffs were down 3.2% in the first 3 quarters of 2025 compared to the previous year, even as the overall Canadian economy grew 1.5%. The tariffs created a 2-speed economy, the sectors exposed to the U.S. border contracting, the rest of the economy growing moderately. Softwood lumber, the long-running trade dispute that predates the Trump tariffs by decades, saw manufacturing drop 7.3% in a single month. Energy, benefiting from a lower 10% tariff rate rather than 25%, has been more resilient. Canadian energy exports found that the sheer volume of U.S. dependence on Canadian oil creates a natural floor for the trade relationship, even under tariff pressure. Chapter 6. The Pivot. Can Canada Change? Mark Carney came to the Prime Minister's office in March 2025 with credentials that no previous Canadian Prime Minister possessed: former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, architect of the post-2008 Global Financial Stability Framework, the person who managed the Bank of England through Brexit. His arrival in Canadian politics was itself a statement about the severity of what Canada was facing. This was not a routine political transition. It was a crisis recruitment. Carney's economic response has 3 pillars. First, trade diversification. Canada has already recovered nearly $11 billion of the $18.5 billion in trade lost to the U.S. by redirecting exports to 27 other markets. Gold exports to non-U.S. markets led the recovery. Energy products found new buyers. The diversification has happened faster than most analysts expected, which is encouraging, but the $7.5 billion gap that remains illustrates the scale of what 77% dependency means when the customer reduces its orders. Second, internal trade liberalization. Carney has pushed aggressively to dismantle provincial trade barriers, using the emergency of the tariff crisis to move faster on regulatory harmonization than any previous federal government. Whether the provinces will accept the degree of economic integration required, particularly on professional licensing, which touches both economic productivity and provincial political identity, remains the central uncertain variable in the reform program. Third, infrastructure investment. Carney has announced major investments in ports, rail, and digital infrastructure, the physical and digital architecture that trade diversification requires. You cannot redirect $700 billion of trade flows without port capacity on both coasts, without rail connections to those ports, and without the trade finance and insurance infrastructure that exporters to new markets need. Building that infrastructure takes years, not months. Chapter 7. The CUSMA Review. Everything in Canada's economic situation right now converges on one date, July 2026. That is when the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA in Canada, USMCA in the United States, is scheduled for its formal review. The agreement, which replaced NAFTA in 2020, is what has kept most Canadian exports flowing to the United States under preferential terms, even as tariff tensions escalated. CUSMA-compliant goods have largely been shielded from the worst tariff rates. CUSMA gives Canada its most important leverage in the trade relationship. The July review could produce three outcomes. The first is renewal on broadly similar terms, most tariffs removed or reduced, Canada retaining preferential access to the American market. This is the scenario that most Canadian economists are hoping for. The second is a renegotiation that produces permanent sectoral tariffs, particularly on steel, aluminum, and automotive, with a lower overall tariff rate on other goods. This is the scenario that TD Economics calls the new permanent reality. The third is a breakdown, no agreement, permanent tariffs remaining, and Canada forced to accelerate its diversification strategy without the CUSMA safety net. This is the scenario that produces a recession. Deloitte's baseline forecast, published in January 2026, assumes most U.S. tariffs on Canada are removed by the third quarter of 2026, essentially assuming a successful CUSMA review. Even in that optimistic scenario, Deloitte expects Canadian GDP growth of only 1.5% in 2026. In the escalation scenario, the one where the review fails, the Bank of Canada's modeling shows a recession lasting 3 quarters, with GDP 1.25% lower than the baseline by the end of 2027. The entire Canadian economic outlook for the next 5 years pivots on what happens in those negotiations. Chapter 8. Was the dependency a mistake? The question this episode started with, was Canada's dependency on the United States a mistake, has a precise answer, no, and then yes, and the timing matters. In 1988, the choice was correct. A country of 26 million people, sharing a 9,000-kilometer border with the world's largest economy, had one obvious development strategy: maximize integration with that economy. The FTA and NAFTA produced exactly the outcomes their architects promised. Canadian GDP per capita grew from approximately $15,000 in 1988 to $55,000 in 2022. Canadian manufacturing became more productive under the competitive pressure of American markets. The prosperity of the NAFTA era is real, and it was built on the dependency. The choice became questionable sometime in the 2000s, when the productivity gap with the United States began widening, when internal trade barriers continued to fragment the domestic market, and when the concentration of export destinations deepened rather than diversified. By 2024, Canada's eggs were more concentrated in the American basket than they had been in 1994. That deepening of dependency happened during years when Canada had the prosperity, the political stability, and the institutional capacity to diversify. It did not. That is the choice that is now costing Canada. The tariff war did not create Canada's economic vulnerabilities. It revealed them. The productivity gap existed before February 2025. The internal trade barriers existed before February 2025. The export concentration existed before February 2025. The tariff war is the forcing function, the crisis that is finally making the reforms that Canada needed to make regardless of what happened at the border. Whether Canada uses this crisis as the beginning of genuine structural change, building the ports, removing the internal barriers, investing in the productivity that comes from technology and competition rather than resource exports and geographic proximity, or whether it negotiates its way back to something like the pre-2025 arrangement and resumes the comfortable dependency, is the question that the next decade will answer. The CUSMA review in July 2026 will tell us which Canada chooses. This is Macro Atlas, the Canada versus Australia episode, which tells the story of what happens when one country diversifies and one doesn't, is coming next. Subscribe, and we will tell you what Australia did differently and whether it was better. Thank you for watching.